Welcome to Geopolitics on the Map. We all know that geopolitics can get pretty messy. Thank God we got a map. I'm your host, Josh. Today we are going to be looking at the current referendums that are taking place in the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. All right, let's go. Let's first start out with reviewing where exactly these are going to be taking place. Here on the map, you can see we have Hersonska Oblast, Zaporozhka Oblast, Donetska Oblast, and Luhanska Oblast. These are the three areas that will be holding the referendums. We're also going to take a look at some historical information to put this stuff into perspective. Just to explain, each of these four areas have a varying percentage of occupation. Luhanska Oblast was at one point 100% occupied, but the Ukrainian army has been able to liberate a small percentage. And then Donetska, Zaporozhka, and Hersonska Oblast have significantly smaller than 95%. Let's review. Donetska Oblast was one of the oblasts that was occupied since 2014. Zaporozhka Oblast is where the nuclear reactor is, and Hersonska Oblast. Kherson is the only oblast provincial city, administrative city, that is currently occupied, which is why it's so important to the Russian army. All right, let's take a look at some historical information. I find that this map right here is important in understanding some historical context of the region by region, oblast by oblast, support for, I guess, a Ukrainian type identity. So this is the 1991 Ukrainian independence referendum separating from the Soviet Union. So these borders are the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic borders, and they became the independent Ukrainian borders. You can see this is Hersonska Oblast, Zaporozhka Oblast, Donetska Oblast, and Luhanska Oblast. And you can see their relatively high support for separating from the greater Soviet Union, becoming an independent Ukrainian state. Very important, I believe. And let's continue to look at some more. So here, this is where I found this from the Brookings Institute, pulling information from the Verkhovna Rada, the Supreme Council of Ukraine. The first presidential election, kind of important. And I think we're coming up to more of a current standpoint. So this is 2010 presidential election. The support for the candidate Yanukovych, who did go on to win. And this is his rival. Oh, wait. We want to go to, yes, okay. This is Yushchenko, who the previous president before Yanukovych. Yanukovych did go against Yushchenko, but he lost. So you see where Yanukovych had a lot of his support was in the Donbass, right? Whereas his opponent, Tymoshenko, was had more support in the far west. Now, you can kind of look at these two candidates. One is pro-Kremlin, right? Yanukovych. One is more pro-NATO, I guess you could kind of say, Tymoshenko. You can see where the numbers lie in 2010, just 4 years before everything that happened in 2014. And now we come up to 2014, the Euromaidan. You see there were protests all throughout the country in varying sizes. And so you kind of see the evolution of Ukrainian identity as a nation state and kind of its regionality. I think that's pretty important. Okay, and here's some context. This is the original separation of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, as opposed to the entire size of Donetsk Oblast and Luhanska Oblast. And then Crimea was a separate, had a separate referendum, whereas the DNR and LNR had their own referendums that we're going to take a look at also in more detail. Okay, this is an interesting one right here. This is the 2001 census that kind of gives you so an understanding of the language difference, which is separate from kind of a national identity, right? This is the preference of Russian language as your kind of home used, in the house used language, because Ukraine is a bilingual country. Nearly everybody speaks some sort of fluency of Ukrainian and Russian. They just have a preference towards one. So you see there's more Russified kind of a Russian preference in the east, whereas the west is much more Ukrainian, higher Ukrainian preference. Okay. So now let's take a look at the Crimean referendum in 2014. There was a lot of problems that happened within that referendum for independence from Ukraine towards Russia. As you can see here, this is from the sources, the Crimea Voting Commission. Nearly 97% voted to join the Russian Federation. Statistically speaking, for any election, this is unusually high. And it also says there was no reported, or it went unreported, the favor of staying as part of Ukraine. You can see some of the propaganda that was also present within Crimea. This is also the time where the Little Green Men had basically commandeered Crimea from Ukraine, and Ukraine didn't have the capacity to push these Spetsnaz type soldiers out of Crimea. Here we go right here, some more kind of propaganda where it's said that they were forced to vote to leave Ukraine and join Russia. This is more on there was some accusations and allegations of fraud within the DNR and LNR separatist votes. There was also a lot of lack of clarity in what was being asked. So here is, so basically it was asked in a very general sense, do you want to become an independent entity, right? Which is very vague, right? Is that independent of Ukraine? Is that part of a federal system like Russia has, but still associated to Kiev? So it was very general. And as we saw on the map, only maybe 50% of the Oblast itself was voting for this. And you had people fleeing the conflict along the fronts of those areas into Russia or further into Ukraine. And so is it really an accurate gauge of what the population wanted? I would say no. And we come to that problem now where you have a lot of people have left these occupied oblasts further into Ukraine or into Europe. And so is that really what these oblasts want, the populations want? Okay. Russia itself is known for having some dubious elections. An independent vote monitoring group, Gallows, which the Russians have identified as a foreign agent, were reported to have found over 5,000 voting violations. This is the most recent election in Russia, where sure, Putin's party lost some support, but he still maintains a significant authority within the country. And so here, let's talk about the refugee status. How many internal or externally displaced peoples are in Ukraine, in and around Ukraine, are Ukrainians, right? It says within the 7 months of the war, there have been nearly 6 million people have left the country, and an equal number have been displaced and are still in Ukraine, right? So we're looking at roughly 12 million people of a country that has roughly 45 million people. That's roughly a quarter of the population. And so if we were to look back at the map, is that an accurate gauge of what these areas want? Is it a true referendum? Is it an honest vote or just a pseudo referendum? Here's some more information about how people fled the various areas. Izium was recently liberated, and you see other areas and where they went within Ukraine. And the many, obviously, those that could leave Ukraine have, although the men have been barred from leaving, and so they're still within Ukraine. Let's look at one last thing, right? I want to look at the amount of partisan activity in some of these areas, right? Because it's not just the Ukrainian army versus the Russian army. There are occupied areas where there are military activities taking place. Maybe it's guerrilla activities, maybe it's simply protest. And these are centered around Kherson, right? The one regional capital that is occupied, as well as some of the other larger cities like Melitopol is a pretty large city within Zaporozhye Oblast, and Berdyansk, also within Zaporozhye Oblast. And so some of these could be, like I said, guerrilla fighting. They could be simple sabotage of bridges and infrastructure, railroad, that are inhibiting the activities of the Russian military, making their occupation even more difficult. So with all of this said, I think we can say that no matter what the results of these referendums are, that they are not a fair representation of what the populations of these oblasts really desire. And likely, and one thing we need to watch out for is if there's any independent monitoring of these votes. So we'll take a look over the next week or so and see how everything turns out for these areas. And I think that'll be interesting to watch. So let's take a look, and we will see you guys later. All right, bye.